The warm afternoon sun cast golden rays over the bustling park, where the soft, soulful sound of a violin filled the air. It was an unassuming corner, shaded by towering oaks, where Jamal often played. At just 12 years old, his small frame stood with surprising confidence, his dark, hopeful eyes closed as he lost himself in the music. The violin he cradled was worn and scratched, its wood chipped from years of careful use. Yet despite its age, it sang under Jamal's touch, each note resonating with stories of struggle and hope that only he could tell. The crowd that gathered was a mix of curious passersby and those who had come to recognize the boy's talent. Coins clinked into the open case at his feet, and for Jamal, every sound was a promise. Each coin meant food on the table, less worry on his mother's tired face, and a glimmer of relief for his younger siblings who shared the small, two-room apartment. Music was his escape, but more importantly, it was his way of fighting for survival. On that day, however, the gentle spell was abruptly broken. The crowd's murmurs faded as two uniformed figures emerged, their boots echoing on the pavement. The first officer, tall with a square jaw and eyes that carried a permanent scowl, called out in a voice that sliced through the air, "Hey, boy, cut that out. You're causing a disturbance." Jamal's eyes shot open, the bow in his hand stuttering to a halt. Fear coiled in his stomach as the reality of the situation dawned on him. He glanced at the crowd, now silent, eyes shifting uncomfortably away from his own. The man's voice was sharp, laden with authority that weighed heavily on the young musician. "You hear me? Pack it up, now," the officer barked, stepping closer. Jamal's heart pounded as he struggled to find his voice. "I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't trying to—" "You're not here to argue," interrupted the second officer, shorter but equally menacing, with an expression that said he was used to not being questioned. The tension in the air thickened, and the crowd seemed to shrink back, as if afraid of being drawn into the unfolding scene. It was then that a voice broke the silence, a deep, commanding voice that carried a tone of calm authority. "Excuse me, officers, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Heads turned as a tall man with silver hair stepped forward from the crowd. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his presence was magnetic. There was an instant recognition among a few onlookers. Whispers of his name passed through the crowd like an electric current. Theodore Marshall, the philanthropist and magnate of the classical music world, stood with his eyes fixed on Jamal and the two officers. His gaze was not of anger, but of determination and an unspoken promise of protection. The taller officer narrowed his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "And who might you be, interrupting official police business?" His tone was edged with irritation. Theodore held his ground, his voice steady and clear. "I'm someone who won't stand by and watch injustice unfold. This boy was sharing his gift with the world, not committing a crime. And unless you have a legitimate reason for this, I suggest you reconsider your approach." A hush fell over the crowd. Some reached for their phones, recording the confrontation, eyes wide with anticipation. Jamal's chest heaved, the rush of adrenaline making his hands tremble. The officers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. The shorter one's jaw tightened, but he stepped back slightly, muttering under his breath. The taller officer hesitated, looking at the crowd now staring at them, eyes accusing and questioning. With a heavy exhale, the taller officer finally said, "Fine, but next time, make sure you have a permit." His words were hollow, meant to save face, as he turned on his heel and walked away, his partner following close behind. The tension dissolved into murmurs as the officers departed, leaving behind a crowd that exhaled collectively, the spell of silence breaking. Theodore turned to Jamal, his eyes softening. He knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "What's your name, young man?" he asked, the kindness in his voice making Jamal's eyes well up despite himself. "Jamal, sir," he whispered, barely trusting his own voice. The violin in his hands felt heavier now, as if the day's events had transferred their weight into the wood. Theodore nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Well, Jamal, it seems you have quite the audience today. And I must say, you play beautifully. How long have you been playing?" Jamal swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "Since I was 8, sir. My father taught me before he passed." The memory threatened to spill into tears, but Jamal held it back, his gaze unwavering. Theodore's expression softened further, a glint of understanding crossing his eyes. "You shouldn't be playing just for passers-by in a park, Jamal. You deserve to be on a stage, where the world can see what you're capable of." The words sank into Jamal slowly, their meaning vast and hard to grasp. Before Jamal could respond, Theodore stood and addressed the crowd that lingered, still watching the exchange. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've witnessed something special today, and I, for one, intend to ensure that this young talent is not left to fade into the background." Jamal's eyes widened as Theodore handed him a business card, the embossed letters catching the sunlight. "Call this number when you're ready, Jamal. There's a place waiting for you at the best music school in the country." The crowd erupted in surprised applause, and Jamal felt a warmth spread through him, not just from the recognition, but from the sense of possibility that the moment carried. He glanced at the card in his hand, the name shimmering like a beacon, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that something more than survival might be within reach. The applause still echoed in Jamal's mind as the crowd began to disperse. His heart raced, not from fear, but from a new, unfamiliar thrill. Hope. Theodore Marshall stood beside him, an imposing yet warm presence, as if shielding him from the reality that had just unfolded. The card in Jamal's hand felt almost magical, a ticket to a world he had never dared dream about. The murmurs of the crowd mixed with the city's distant hum, but all Jamal could hear was the thundering beat of his own heart. "Sir, why would you help someone like me?" Jamal's voice was small, cautious. It was a question rooted in years of watching dreams be out of reach and expectations shattered by reality. Theodore's eyes, deep and thoughtful, met Jamal's. "Because I was once just like you, standing on a street corner, hoping someone would notice. I know the gift when I see it, and I know how easily it can be lost if no one lends a hand." Jamal's eyes widened, trying to imagine the polished, powerful man before him as a boy with dreams as fragile as his own. He glanced at the card again, the embossed letters reading, "Marshall Conservatory for Musical Arts." He had heard of it in whispered tones. It was a place reserved for the prodigies of the world, a place that seemed galaxies away from his reality. Before Jamal could gather his thoughts, a familiar voice called out from the edge of the dispersing crowd. "Jamal." His mother, a petite woman with hair pulled back tightly and eyes that carried the weight of endless worry, pushed her way through. She looked between Theodore and her son, confusion creasing her brow. "What happened? Why are people staring?" Theodore extended a hand to her, introducing himself with the practiced ease of someone used to commanding attention. "Mrs. Roberts, your son is exceptional. I was just offering him an opportunity to develop his talent at the Marshall Conservatory." She blinked, disbelief and shock battling on her face. The Marshall Conservatory. Her gaze turned to Jamal, searching his face for answers. Jamal nodded, the spark of hope still alight in his eyes. "Ma'am, I understand that this is a lot to take in," Theodore continued, "but talent like Jamal's deserves to be nurtured. I'm offering him a full scholarship, tuition, room, board, everything covered. He belongs on a stage, not just here on the streets." The weight of the offer settled over them, thick and heavy. Jamal's mother bit her lip, eyes glistening as she looked at her son. She knew the streets too well, their harsh lessons, the way they chewed up dreams and left people surviving but not living. This chance was everything she'd prayed for but never dared believe would come. "Jamal," she said softly, her voice trembling, "is this what you want?" Jamal didn't hesitate. The image of his father teaching him to hold the bow, the pride in his mother's eyes when he played his first song, and the laughter of his younger siblings when he made up silly melodies flooded his mind. He looked up at Theodore, then back at his mother, and nodded firmly. "Yes, Mom, I want this." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, her expression shifting from disbelief to determination. She turned to Theodore, holding his gaze. "Then thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." Theodore smiled, the kind that said he knew this was just the beginning. He placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Pack your things, Jamal. Your new journey starts next week." The crowd had mostly moved on by now, but a few stragglers lingered, watching the scene with expressions ranging from admiration to curiosity. Jamal felt the weight of their gazes, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He wasn't just a boy playing violin in the park anymore. He was a boy with a chance to be more than the world expected. The days before Jamal's departure were a whirlwind of activity and emotions. The small apartment in which he and his family lived buzzed with a mix of excitement, anticipation, and an underlying thread of nervous energy. Each corner of the home seemed to resonate with unspoken thoughts. His mother moved around with purpose, folding clothes and placing them into the worn suitcase that had been passed down in the family for years. She hesitated with each item, her fingers brushing the fabric before placing it down, as if imprinting a part of herself into every fold. She carefully tucked in small reminders of home, a framed photo of the family, slightly faded but cherished, a hand-sewn patch his father had worn on his jacket, which now carried memories and stories, and a scarf that still carried the faint scent of her lavender perfume, a comforting reminder of warmth and safety. The kitchen table, marked with scratches and the remnants of daily life, now held open sheet music and a small collection of Jamal's things. His two younger brothers watched with wide, glistening eyes, their excitement barely contained. One of them, Malik, the more spirited of the two, bounced on his heels. "You're gonna be famous, Jamal. Just wait until everyone sees how good you are." His voice was a mix of pride and awe, filling the room with hope that felt tangible. "Play something for us before you go," said Amir, the quieter of the brothers, his voice soft but earnest. "One last time, please." Jamal glanced at his mother, who paused her packing and looked up with a bittersweet smile. The room was silent for a moment, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, a metronome marking the rhythm of their shared life. Jamal lifted his violin, its wood smooth and familiar beneath his fingers. He took a breath and let the bow touch the strings, drawing out a tune that was simple yet poignant. It was a song his father used to hum when times were tough, but hope lingered just beyond the horizon. The melody filled the room, stretching into every corner and weaving through the memories embedded in the worn walls. It spoke of late nights spent under dim lights, of laughter shared over simple meals, and of moments when dreams seemed fragile but unbreakable. His mother wiped away silent tears that clung to the corners of her eyes, the kind that held both pride and the deep ache of letting go. She knew this moment was as much a goodbye as it was a beginning. The music slowed, lingering on the final note that hung in the air like promise, and Jamal's siblings clapped, the sound breaking the spell of the song. His mother stepped forward, pulling him into a hug that felt like a shield, as if she could pour all her love and protection into that single embrace. "Remember who you are, Jamal. No matter how big the world gets, you are loved, and you are enough," she whispered, her voice steady but laced with emotion. The morning of his departure arrived too soon, with the first rays of sunlight slipping through the gaps in the curtains, casting golden patterns across the room. Jamal stood at the door with his suitcase in one hand and the violin case in the other. The air was thick with unspoken words, the kind that sat in the chest and made breathing a little harder. Outside, the sound of a car engine rumbling to life drew everyone's attention. A sleek black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, waited at the curb. Theodore's driver, a tall man with a warm but professional demeanor, stepped out and nodded respectfully. The neighborhood, always buzzing with morning chatter, fell into a hushed anticipation as eyes peeked from behind curtains and heads turned to watch the scene unfold. Jamal hugged his brothers, who tried to act tough but couldn't hide their watery smiles. "You better write to us, okay?" Malik said, trying to sound commanding but failing as his voice cracked. Jamal laughed lightly, a sound that eased the tension in his chest. "I will, I promise. And next time, I'll play for you on a real stage." His mother stood by, her hand resting on the doorframe as if holding herself steady. When Jamal turned to her, she pulled him into one last embrace. The familiar scent of home, a mix of lavender and warm bread, wrapped around him. "Go, my son. Make the world hear your music," she said, stepping back, but keeping her eyes on him as if memorizing every detail of his face. The drive to the Marshall Conservatory felt like a dream. The city passed by in blurs of color, shops opening their doors, children heading to school, and the morning sun casting a soft glow on everything it touched. Jamal sat in the back seat, the violin resting on his lap, his fingers tracing the familiar edges out of habit. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, offering a reassuring nod. "Big day, huh?" His voice was gentle, breaking the silence. Jamal nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "Yeah, the biggest." The conservatory loomed into view, its grand facade with marble columns and intricate carvings announcing its status as a place where only the exceptional thrived. It stood apart from the surrounding buildings, like a castle of dreams amidst the ordinary. The entrance was abuzz with students, each dressed in crisp uniforms, carrying instruments that gleamed under the morning light. They moved with purpose, their conversations filled with musical jargon and laughter that spoke of a shared world Jamal was stepping into for the first time. As the car rolled to a stop, Jamal's heart thudded in his chest. Theodore was there, waiting at the top of the wide steps, his presence as commanding as ever. He wore a warm smile, one that seemed to reach into the car and pull Jamal's nerves away, replacing them with resolve. "Welcome, Jamal," Theodore said, his voice strong yet soft, carrying a weight that spoke of new beginnings. "This is where your story begins anew." Jamal took a breath, stepping out of the car. The violin in his hand felt heavier, not from fear, but from the significance of the moment. He climbed the stairs, each step echoing in his mind like a heartbeat, a drumroll leading to the unknown. Behind him, the whispers of his past fell silent, leaving only the song of possibility and the faint, encouraging echo of his family's love. The double doors of the conservatory swung open with a subtle creak, revealing a world that took Jamal's breath away. The entrance hall was grand, with vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes depicting scenes from classical music's storied history. Chandeliers hung like clusters of stars, casting soft light over the polished marble floors that reflected the hustle of students hurrying past. Each step Jamal took reverberated through the space, mixing with the faint notes of pianos, violins, and cellos that seemed to come from every direction, creating a symphony that made his chest tighten with awe and anticipation. Theodore walked beside him, a steady presence among the whirl of activity. "This place," Theodore said, gesturing to the walls lined with portraits of musicians whose names were etched into history, "has been home to countless talents. And now, it's your turn to make your mark." The weight of those words settled in Jamal's chest, sparking a fire of both excitement and apprehension. As they moved deeper into the conservatory, Jamal's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. Students, some not much older than him, stood in small groups, practicing their pieces or discussing compositions. Their uniforms were sharp, with crisp lines and embroidered crests that marked them as members of this elite institution. The sight reminded Jamal of how different he was, with his well-worn clothes and second-hand violin that had seen more corners of the city than he could count. A pang of insecurity twisted in his stomach, but he pushed it down, gripping the handle of his violin case tighter. Theodore led him to a smaller, quieter room just off the main hallway. Inside, the walls were lined with books on music theory, sheet music in every language imaginable, and instruments that gleamed under the soft light. Seated at a grand piano was a woman with hair as white as snow, tied up in a loose bun. She looked up when they entered, her sharp blue eyes taking in Jamal with an expression that was both stern and curious. "Jamal, meet Madame Lisette," Theodore said with a smile. "She's one of our most respected instructors here, a pianist whose performances have graced the halls of Europe's finest concert halls." Madame Lisette stood up, her back straight and posture impeccable. She moved with the grace of someone who carried years of experience and discipline. "So, you're the young man causing such a stir," she said, her voice as crisp as the air on a winter's morning. Jamal swallowed, feeling suddenly very small. But he met her gaze, refusing to let his nerves show. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady but low. "Show me," she said simply, nodding toward his violin. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as Jamal's heart drummed in his chest. He glanced at Theodore, who offered a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Jamal opened his case, the familiar scent of varnish, and would wafting up as he lifted his violin. The bow in his hand felt both a weapon and a lifeline. He positioned the violin under his chin, closed his eyes for a moment to center himself, and then let the first note sing out. It was hesitant at first, but as he moved through the piece, a piece his father had taught him, full of hope and quiet strength, his confidence grew. The room filled with a melody that seemed to carry the echoes of laughter, struggle, and perseverance, touching the edges of memory and ambition alike. Madame Lisette's expression remained unreadable throughout, her fingers tapping lightly against her crossed arms, as if counting time. When the final note fell into silence, Jamal opened his eyes, his chest tight as he waited for her reaction. Theodore's smile was soft, a glimmer of pride sparking in his eyes. There was a pause, the kind that stretched time into something almost unbearable. Finally, Madame Lisette spoke. "There is rawness in your playing, a soul that cannot be taught," she said, her tone softened. "But you will learn control, discipline, and the finesse that turns raw talent into something extraordinary. I expect you to work harder than you ever have before." "Yes, ma'am," Jamal replied, the weight of her words heavy but welcome. This was what he had wanted, to be challenged, to be seen, and to be given the chance to grow. "Good," she said, nodding once. "We begin tomorrow at dawn. Don't be late." With that, she turned back to the piano, signaling that the meeting was over. Theodore rested a hand on Jamal's shoulder as they left the room. "You did well," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." As they walked back down the hallway, the reality of his new life settled in. The doubts that had whispered in his ear now spoke louder. Would he be able to keep up? Would he prove that he belonged here among prodigies who had been trained from birth? But as the notes of a distant violin drifted through the hallway and reached him, a calm determination took root in Jamal's heart. He would not waste this chance. That night, alone in the small dormitory room that had been assigned to him, Jamal unpacked his suitcase. The photo of his family, now placed carefully on the small desk by his bed, seemed to smile at him. The hand-sewn patch sat beside it, a reminder of his father's unwavering belief in him. He picked up the scarf, and held it to his face, breathing in the comforting scent of home. Outside, the city was alive, a blend of voices, traffic, and the occasional burst of music that floated up from open windows. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Jamal replayed the day's events over and over, feeling the pressure and the hope intertwine. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was his. The silence of the room was broken only by the steady thrum of his heartbeat and the faintest hint of a melody that played in his mind, a melody of new beginnings. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Jamal's alarm went off, a sharp sound that sliced through the stillness of his small dorm room. He sat up, blinking sleep from his eyes and staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, the realization of where he was settling over him like a weight. Today marked the beginning of his journey at the Marshall Conservatory, a day that promised challenge and change. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and took a deep breath, the crisp morning air cooling the apprehension simmering in his chest. The corridors of the conservatory were already alive with activity. Students in sharp uniforms moved with purpose, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Jamal felt a rush of nerves as he walked past them, violin in hand, receiving sidelong glances and whispers that prickled the back of his neck. He wasn't just the new student, he was the outsider, the boy who had come from playing on street corners into the halls of a world-class institution. The sense of difference gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside and pressed forward, his father's voice echoing in his memory. Never let them see you doubt yourself. Madame Lizette's practice room was illuminated by the golden glow of dawn filtering through tall windows. She stood at the piano, tapping her fingers against the keys, her expression as precise as her movements. "You're on time." "Good," she said without looking up. "Today, we will assess the scope of your abilities." Jamal nodded, positioning his violin and inhaling deeply. He played the piece Madame Lisette had assigned him the day before, a technically demanding composition that tested both his endurance and skill. As the notes filled the room, he felt the weight of every critique, every expectation pressing down on him. Madame Lizette's eyes flicked from his fingers to his face, her expression unreadable as always. When he finished, the room fell into silence, the last note hanging in the air like a question. "Your technique is rough around the edges, but there is undeniable passion in your playing," she finally said, stepping away from the piano. "That will be your greatest asset and your biggest obstacle. You must learn to control it." "Yes, ma'am," Jamal said, the determination in his voice stronger than the doubt that lurked beneath. The morning passed in a blur of scales, exercises, and endless repetitions. By midday, Jamal's fingers were sore, his muscles aching from holding the violin for hours. He glanced around at his peers, noticing how easily they seemed to flow through their routines, their faces calm and expressions confident. His gaze met that of Charles, a tall, impeccably dressed student with an air of superiority. Charles had been watching him with a smirk that spoke volumes without saying a word. During the short lunch break, Jamal sat alone under a large oak tree in the courtyard, the packed lunch his mother had made feeling like a link to home that he needed desperately. He unwrapped the sandwich slowly, more out of habit than hunger, when Charles and a group of students approached. Their laughter was casual, but their eyes were sharp, assessing. "So, you're the prodigy from the streets everyone's talking about," Charles said, folding his arms as he looked down at Jamal. The sarcasm in his tone cut through the warm air like a cold wind. "Must be nice getting in without years of training." Jamal met Charles's eyes, refusing to let his own waver. "I worked for this, same as anyone," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Charles scoffed, glancing at his friends who chuckled in response. "We'll see how long that lasts. This place isn't just for show. It's for those who can keep up." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "Try not to embarrass yourself. As they walked away, their laughter fading into the sounds of the busy courtyard, Jamal clenched his fists, feeling a mix of anger and resolve flare up inside him. He had expected challenges, but he hadn't anticipated the kind of rivalry that Charles embodied. The pressure of proving himself weighed heavily, but it also sparked something fierce within him. He would show everyone, that he wasn't just the boy from a park, but someone worthy of being here. The rest of the day continued with classes that tested every skill he had. Music theory sessions left his head spinning, and ensemble practice brought new challenges. The conductor, a man with sharp eyes and a demanding presence, pushed them relentlessly, expecting nothing short of perfection. Mistakes were met with clipped comments and raised eyebrows, and Jamal found himself holding his breath, willing his fingers to move faster, his mind to catch up with the new pace. When the day finally ended, the sky was painted with hues of orange and purple, the sun dipping below the horizon. Jamal walked back to his dorm, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. His fingers throbbed, and his shoulders ached from tension. He dropped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the day pressed into him. The whispers of doubt crept back in, the laughter of Charles and his friends playing on repeat in his mind. But then he turned his head and saw the photo of his family, the hand-sewn patch beside it, and the scarf that smelled like home. He closed his eyes, hearing his mother's voice, "Make the world hear your music." The fatigue didn't fade, but the resolve in his chest hardened. This was only the first day, and he knew there would be more like it. But he wasn't here to blend in. He was here to rise. Jamal picked up his violin, fingers protesting as he brought up to his shoulder. He played a soft, familiar tune, one that spoke to the dreams he held and the journey ahead. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the boy within the conservatory walls who played not just to survive, but to make the echoes of hope heard in every corner of the world. The conservatory was alive with the buzz of preparation. The first major recital of the semester was only a week away, and every student could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on them. The halls, usually filled with the hum of casual conversation, were now overtaken by intense practice sessions and whispered strategies. Jamal spent long hours in the practice rooms, the walls lined with mirrors reflecting back a boy determined not to break under pressure. His fingers moved over the strings, the calluses on his hands throbbing but steady. Each note resonated with a mix of hope, frustration, and relentless drive. Word of Jamal's talent had spread, drawing eyes and opinions from all corners of the conservatory. Some watched with admiration, others with doubt. Charles, however, watched with disdain, his brow furrowing every time he caught sight of Jamal practicing. The recital would be the first real test, and Charles was determined to prove who the real prodigy was. He practiced with a vigor that bordered on obsession, his competitive nature sharpened to a point. Madame Lizette was stricter than ever, her critiques biting, but laced with a sharp honesty that pushed Jamal to his limits. "You're letting your emotions control you," she said one afternoon as Jamal's bow faltered on a particularly difficult passage. "Emotion is essential, but without discipline, it will betray you." Her voice echoed in the room, a challenge that clung to the air like a dare. Jamal's jaw tightened, and he nodded, picking up from the beginning and attacking the piece with renewed focus. The days leading up to the recital were a blur of practice, classes, and stolen moments of exhaustion. The closer the event came, the more Jamal felt the pressure in every breath, in every glance that followed him down the halls. The whispers grew louder, rumors swirling about who would shine and who would falter. "Did you hear Charles is playing La Campanella? Only a few can pull that off. I heard that new boy Jamal is aiming for something original. Can he handle it?" On the night before the recital, Jamal sat in his dorm room, the moon casting a cold, silver light through the narrow window. He held his father's patch in one hand, the fabric worn and comforting, and stared at the violin resting on the bed beside him. The doubt that had been an undercurrent throughout the week threatened to break the surface, pulling him into its grasp. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, recalling the way his mother had smiled at him that morning before he left, and the way his father's hands had once guided his through the first notes he'd ever played. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Theodore standing there, dressed casually, but carrying an air of calm authority. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Jamal stepped aside, nodding. Theodore looked around the sparse room, and then at Jamal, a soft smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Tomorrow's a big day," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "How are you holding up?" Jamal hesitated before answering, the vulnerability of the question settling between them. "I'm nervous," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone expects so much, and I don't know if I can live up to it." Theodore nodded, the understanding in his eyes deepening. "Jamal, nerves mean you care. It means what you're doing matters. But remember, talent brought you here. Yes, but heart will keep you here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished stone with an intricate carving. "I carried this with me during my first big performance. It reminded me that even if the world is watching, the music is for me first. Now, it's yours." Jamal took the stone, feeling its weight, solid and reassuring in his palm. He looked up at Theodore, words caught in his throat, but the gratitude in his eyes spoke louder than anything he could say. Theodore patted his shoulder and turned to leave. "Play for yourself first, Jamal. The rest will follow." The morning of the recital arrived, and the conservatory was transformed. The main hall, adorned with crimson curtains and gilded details, was packed with students, instructors, and guests. The air was thick with anticipation, the whispers and quiet shifting of seats creating a symphony of tension. Jamal stood backstage, surrounded by the soft rustle of sheet music and the faint hum of warming-up instruments. Charles passed by, his expression a mask of confidence, but his eyes held a spark of challenge. "Break a string," Charles muttered with a smirk as he walked by, his voice dripping with condescension. Jamal met his gaze, but said nothing, channeling every ounce of his energy into staying focused. As Jamal waited for his name to be called, he reached into his pocket and felt the small stone Theodore had given him. Its cool surface grounded him, and he took a deep breath, letting the noise around him fade. When the announcer's voice called his name, Jamal stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding for a moment before fading into a sea of faces. He could see Theodore in the audience, sitting beside Madame Lisette, whose expression was as sharp as ever, but carried a glint of expectation. Jamal positioned the violin under his chin, the bow poised over the strings. The hall fell into a deep, expectant silence. He played the first note, and it was as if the world disappeared, leaving only the music and the story it told. Each phrase was a testament to where he came from, every shift in the melody a nod to the journey that had brought him here. The doubts, the late nights, the whispers of competition, they melted away as the notes flowed, filled with the passion that had started in a small park and now echoed through the grand hall of the Marshall Conservatory. As the final note hung in the air, there was a heartbeat of silence, heavy and electric, before the hall erupted into applause. Jamal's chest heaved as he took in the sight of people rising to their feet, faces a blur of smiles and clapping hands. Theodore nodded, a small smile of pride playing at his lips, and even Madame Lisette's stern expression softened into a satisfied nod. Jamal bowed, feeling the heat of the lights on his face and the warmth of victory blooming in his chest. But as he stepped off the stage, the fierce eyes of Charles caught his. A storm brewing that promised this was just the beginning of their rivalry. The applause from the recital still echoed in Jamal's ears as the days passed. His performance had been a triumph, whispered about in halls, and noted by instructors who rarely bestowed praise. But with the recognition came more intense eyes on him, eyes that watched and waited for him to stumble. None more so than Charles, whose rivalry had shifted from subtle glances and muttered comments to an unspoken, palpable tension that hung in the air whenever they crossed paths. Jamal pushed himself harder than ever, spending late nights in the practice rooms until his fingers ached and the notes blurred together. Each day was a battle between exhaustion and determination, but the memory of his mother's voice, the weight of his father's patch, and the stone Theodore had given him kept him going. The whispers that once doubted him now carried a different tone: admiration, curiosity, and, for some, jealousy. One afternoon, as Jamal packed up his violin after a long practice, the door to the room swung open. Charles stood there, his arms crossed and a practiced smirk on his face. "Impressive show the other night," he said, his tone not matching the words. "But one performance doesn't make a musician. Let's see if you can keep up." Jamal met his gaze evenly, the weight of fatigue pressing on him, but refusing to let it show. "I'm not here to compete with you, Charles," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm here to be the best I can be." Charles's smirk widened, but there was a glint of something more, something restless and sharp. "That's where you're wrong. Here, you're always competing. And the next showcase is just around the corner. I hope you're ready for it." The door closed behind Charles with a soft thud, leaving the room heavier with his departure. Jamal stared at the closed door, feeling the familiar burn of doubt flare up, but he pushed it aside and focused on the music. The showcase would be different. It was a competition, judged not just by the instructors, but by visiting maestros and music critics from prestigious conservatories across the country. It was an opportunity that could set the course for any student's career, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The weeks leading up to the showcase were a whirlwind of practice, rehearsals, and preparation. Jamal and Charles often found themselves practicing in adjoining rooms, their music colliding in a storm of fierce determination. Late one night, when most of the students had gone to bed, Jamal lingered in the practice hall, the moonlight streaming through the high windows and casting long shadows across the polished floor. He played a piece that spoke to the core of him, one that told the story of long nights in the park, of struggle and silent prayers for better days. Unbeknownst to him, Madame Lisette stood in the shadow of the hallway, listening. Her usual stern expression softened as she heard the raw emotion in Jamal's playing. She knew the showcase would not just be a test of skill, but of resilience, and she hoped Jamal's heart was as strong as his hands. The day of the showcase dawned with a crispness in the air that matched the tension coursing through the conservatory. Students moved like dancers, precise and focused, their expressions set in determination. Jamal dressed carefully, his hands lingering over the scarf his mother had given him, a silent reminder of the reason he was here. Theodore had wished him luck that morning, his voice calm but encouraging. "Play like you did in the park, Jamal. Play as if it's just you and the music." Backstage, Jamal could hear the muffled sound of performances before him, each greeted with applause that set his nerves on edge. He closed his eyes, fingers brushing over the stone in his pocket, feeling its cool surface against his skin. When Charles's name was announced, a ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. Jamal listened as Charles played, the performance technically flawless, each note precise and sharp. The applause that followed was thunderous, as expected. Then, it was Jamal's turn. The silence that followed the announcer's voice felt heavy, pressing down on him as he stepped onto the stage. The lights blinded him for a moment, but he steadied himself, positioning his violin and letting the world fade away. He played a piece of his own creation, one that spoke of hope, resilience, and the silent battles fought when no one was watching. Each note carried the weight of his journey, the whispers of doubt, the echoes of support, and the fire that had pushed him to this moment. As the final note resonated, the hall held its breath for a split second before erupting into applause. Jamal's chest heaved, not just from exertion, but from the release of weeks of tension. Theodore stood, clapping with a smile that was rare and genuine. Even Madame Lizette gave a small nod of approval. But as Jamal stepped off the stage, the storm in Charles's eyes promised that this was far from over. The applause from the showcase still lingered in the halls of the conservatory days later. The performances had been discussed, debated, and dissected by instructors and students alike. Jamal's piece had left an impression not just for its skill, but for the raw emotion it carried. Whispers of admiration followed him as he moved through the halls, but so did the weight of expectations that grew heavier with each day. Charles, however, was a storm brewing on the horizon. He had played flawlessly, but the attention that Jamal's performance garnered gnawed at him. For Charles, this wasn't just a matter of talent. It was a battle for recognition, a fight to maintain his place at the top. The rivalry between them, once a simmering undercurrent, now boiled over into outright competition. Jamal kept his focus. The showcase had opened doors, and now letters began to arrive. Invitations to audition for prestigious summer programs, offers for collaborations with esteemed musicians, and inquiries from conservatories known for producing the world's best. Theodore watched with pride as Jamal navigated these new opportunities, offering guidance and support when needed. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in the practice room, sorting through the pile of letters, Charles appeared in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were dark with frustration. "Congratulations, Jamal," he said, the words clipped. "It seems the street performer has become the star." Jamal looked up, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. "Charles, it doesn't have to be this way. There's space for both of us." Charles's jaw tightened, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Easy for you to say when you're the one basking in the limelight." He stepped into the room, lowering his voice. "But remember this, Jamal, talent can be fleeting. You have to be more than a moment." The door closed behind him with a thud, leaving Jamal to process the encounter. The rivalry had never been about hatred. It was about fear. Fear of being forgotten, of being left behind. Jamal understood that better than anyone. But he also knew that the music he played, the story he told through every note, was more than a fleeting moment. It was his life, his struggles, and the dreams of those who believed in him. Days turned into weeks, and the conservatory's pace picked up as another recital approached. This one was a smaller event, a showcase of duets where students were paired to perform together. When the list went up, gasps and whispers erupted as everyone noticed the pairing, Jamal and Charles. The choice was deliberate, a decision made by Madame Lizette, who believed that challenges forged the strongest steel. Rehearsals were tense at first, each boy bringing his own energy to the practice room, the air electric with competition. Charles's playing was precise, technical perfection honed over years of disciplined practice. Jamal's was expressive, carrying the weight of stories untold. The music they were to play required harmony, balance, a dance between control and passion. At first, their differences clashed, the rehearsals marked by silence and strained nods. But as the days passed, something shifted. One evening, after hours of practice, Charles set down his violin and sighed, the frustration on his face softening into something more reflective. "You know, I've worked for this my whole life," he said, not meeting Jamal's eyes. "I've given up everything to be the best." Jamal nodded, understanding more than he let on. "I know, and I've fought to prove that I belong here. Maybe we're not so different after all." Charles looked up, the hardness in his eyes melting away. For the first time, they shared a moment of mutual respect, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they both had taken, each in their own way. The night of the duet recital came, and the air was thick with anticipation. The audience, smaller than at the previous showcase, but just as discerning, waited with bated breath as the two boys took their places on the stage. The lights dimmed, and for a moment, everything was still. Jamal met Charles's eyes, a nod passing between them. The first notes filled the hall, a blend of precision and emotion that captured the room. They played as if they were speaking a language only they knew, each phrase a conversation between equals. The audience leaned in, captivated by the contrast and unity of their styles. When the final chord resonated, it was met not by instant applause, but by a beat of silence, as if the room needed a moment to absorb what had just transpired. Then the applause came, rolling like thunder, and Jamal felt the weight lift from his chest. Madame Lizette's smile was slight but genuine. Theodore clapped with a look of quiet pride, and for the first time, Charles turned to Jamal and smiled, a real, unguarded smile. As they walked off the stage, Charles extended a hand. Maybe there's space for both of us, after all. Jamal took the hand, a grin breaking across his face. Maybe there is. The conservatory, with its grand halls and echoing music, had become more than just a place of learning. It was a place where dreams were tested, where rivalries could turn into respect, and where a boy who once played for coins in a park could rise to be more than anyone expected. Jamal knew that his journey was far from over, but now he walked with the knowledge that he didn't need to face it alone. As the applause faded and the hall emptied, the echoes of their performance lingered, a reminder that music was more than notes. It was connection, perseverance, and the unyielding spirit to rise, note by note, against the odds. Now that you've followed this story full of twists and emotions, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share what you thought about the plot and which moment was your favorite or most gripping. Don't forget to leave a like. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss any new stories we share. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.